Nitsa, thank you very much. And you may well ask if I'm a professor of geopolitics from Israel, and I lectured on my professional topic the other day on borders. What am I doing interested in stained glass windows of synagogues? I'm glad to say that with me tonight is my wife of 40 years, and that is my main love affair in life. A lot of my very close friends know that as a good child professor, I have another love affair for nearly 60 years with the North London Football Club. And I think in the past year or two, I've developed a third love affair with the Hillman windows. Now, I have to say something up front. I'm sure that's what Nitsa was going to say. There are many reasons why I'm interested in these windows. One of them is because David Hillman was my great uncle. There are some members of the Hillman family here in the audience, and others have come to a previous presentation I made. When I was a child, I knew that there was such a thing called the Hillman windows, but what child is interested in stained glass windows in the synagogue? I mean, your friends would think you're boring as hell if that's what you started to talk about. I actually became even more interested in them for a number of reasons. I suppose as you hit the 60 and go past it, you start becoming nostalgic and start investigating your family background, genealogy. But even more than that, almost 40 years ago when I went to live in Israel, the first few years I lived in Jerusalem, and I prayed, I davened at a shul called Renanim in the center of Jerusalem because I had cousins who went there. And it was those cousins who, in the second or third time I was there, they said to me, you know that these are Hillman windows here. I said, oh, that's interesting. I wasn't aware that they were in Jerusalem. And I think from that day onwards, I started to become interested in the David Hillman windows, particularly because of the other connections I had. When I'm in London, which I am quite a lot in the last 2 or 3 years on an extended sabbatical, I rent a very small apartment in St. John's Wood, and I go to the St. John's Wood Synagogue. St. John's Wood has 120 David Hillman windows. Now, I'll talk about them a bit later. Altogether in London, there must be some, I don't know the exact number, some 250, give or take, windows of his, spread over 7 or 8 synagogues, some originally made for those synagogues, such as the ones we saw upstairs, some which have been moved from an original synagogue, and that synagogue closed down, and then rather than, God forbid, destroy the collection or break it up, they were moved to other synagogues and new synagogues which were built elsewhere in London. And again, on one of the slides, I'll show a complete list of the places they are to be found, and maybe some of you are members of those synagogues, and maybe you came along because you wanted to know more about the windows, or maybe you had no idea that the windows in your synagogue were Hillman windows. Some of the rabbis don't know. I know because I've spoken to them. In the last year, I've visited every one of those 250 windows, with one exception, the one that you see here. And if your windows are in the Victoria and Albert, then this window is the only one not to be found in a synagogue. It was originally in a synagogue. It was originally in Bayswater Synagogue. But when the Bayswater windows were moved to Boreham Wood after Bayswater shut down, I don't know what the circumstances were, but one of the windows took a little walk. And today, this particular window is to be found in the stained glass window exhibition in Ely Cathedral. I have an elder son who just came from Israel a few weeks ago to do an LLM in Cambridge, and we were visiting him on Thursday. And I thought, well, we're only 20 miles away. I'll phone them up. It's about time I went to see this window. And unfortunately, the exhibition is closed now for restoration, and they couldn't host me that day. So this is the one window, as you can see, the Purim window by David Hillman, originally made for the Bayswater Synagogue, which was demolished in 1966. I don't know if any of you were ever members of the Bayswater. It was demolished to make way for the West Way, and it was already a declining synagogue. I don't know if the windows went immediately to Boreham Wood or they were stored for a while, but this is the one that didn't quite make it. It went somewhere else and is to be found in that cathedral. What I'd like to do over, say, 45 minutes is divide my remarks into 3. I could talk about As you know, when it's a love affair, you can talk for 10, 20 hours. I'll try and limit my remarks about another 40, 45 minutes because we've already spoken upstairs. And I will divide my remarks into 3 parts. I want to talk about him and his family because that is actually where my interest originally came from. I'm interested in his, which is partially mine, although it's a distant relationship, family, and that ties in with work I've been doing on the impact of Lithuanian rabbis in England of the 20th century, and about which I'll be speaking at Limud this coming December. I then want to say something about where his windows are, give you the inventory, and then come back to talk about some of the styles. As I say, we've spoken a bit about it upstairs, but we'll get a better idea of the diversity of what he has by going through some of these slides. I can't show all the slides in these PowerPoint because I've got about 90 of them, so I'll skip through some as I'm going on. And as I say at the end, if we still have time and if Nietzsche allows us and you want to comment, discuss, you are more than welcome. So let's start by talking about the religious and the family context of who was David Hillman. I should actually make one more introductory comment and say, oh yes, thank you. I'll correct that for next time. A young man to make all those windows. I should say something, and that is to say that his style, as you'll see, is very distinct. It differs from the shul windows before him, and as I'm sure Ruth Jacobson will say it differs very much from the shul windows that came after him. His style is very distinct, but it is a hidden art treasure. To have 250 of these windows throughout London is a real hidden art treasure, not just for the Jewish community, but for the wider lovers of art and of stained glass windows. And I actually think they're not publicized enough. Not enough people get to see them unless you go and attend the synagogue. And my interest in the St. John's Wood synagogue ones are because I live in Israel. I'm used to a Shabbat morning service, which takes 1.5, maximum 2 hours. You go to St. John's Wood and, you know, it's a bit long. So people are used to me there by the 3rd hour, every week patrolling the windows and looking at a different one, and every week finding something new in the windows. It's unbelievable. And people come to me now and they say, have you seen in the corner of this window there's a hand, or there's a house? And there are all sorts of things which show up. You can see he was born at the end of the 19th century in Lithuania. He came with his father, who I'll say something about. His father was rabbi, later Dayan, Samuel Shmuel Hillman, who originally came to Glasgow in the early 20th century. Wasn't there for so long, I think less than 10 years. He was a communal rabbi in Glasgow. He was then called to be the head of the London Beth Din, where he lived for 20, almost 30 years before he eventually moved on to Israel. So David Hillman grew up as a younger child, for a few years in Glasgow, and then he and his sister basically grew up as young adults and teenagers in London. He did receive, the Hillman family is a very prominent Lithuanian Orthodox rabbinical family for generations and generations, and he was pushed to a certain extent by his father to receive rabbinical ordination. He did receive it, and for a few years he worked as a rabbi at the Sandys Row Synagogue, one of the few synagogues in the East End, by the way, which is still functioning. But that wasn't to his liking. He was really into art, and that's what he became eventually, an artist. It is said, one of the family stories, histories, it may be true, it may not be true. His father was clearly not pleased later in life that he took the art as his main thing and, pushed the rabbinical studies aside. And actually, they didn't get on because of it. They didn't have a good relationship between them. But one of the family stories is it was less because that he did stained glass windows for synagogues. And one story is that because when he was training, he had to paint nudes. Now, whether that's true or not, I have no idea, but it's a great story. But clearly his father was not pleased with him for becoming an artist full-time rather than a rabbi, even if it was in shuls. He himself resided in St. John's Wood in Priory Road. At the top of the house he had a studio. And I remember very vaguely as a young child, because he died in the 73 or 74, 72. I was born in 56. He was a great uncle. He was married to my great aunt, basically. You know, in those days, the terrible thing a kid had to do on a Sunday afternoon was visit the aunts and uncles for Sunday afternoon tea and be quiet as well. And I suppose twice a year we would visit the Hillmans, and he would take us up into his studio upstairs where these windows were both designed and made. The amazing thing about 250 windows was that he did them by himself with one assistant. Assistant stroke slave, it's not sure what. But he did them by himself. He did not become a rich man from these windows. He was not business-minded at all. There's an exhibition in St. John's Wood on the stairs showing the amount paid to him for the windows in St. John's Wood. It was nothing, £150. And it was his wife, the doctor, Annie Hillman Rabinowitz, who basically brought the living in. She was a GP. That's where I come into the story, because my grandmother was the oldest of the Rabinowitz brothers and sisters. In other words, his wife was a younger sister of my grandmother. I probably have some... this was David, I'll come back to that. David Hillman, here you see him as a young man, as an artist, with his hat. And you can see him, I believe that's with his father, I'm not sure, in the middle picture. But that's the few pictures we have of that time. This was his father, Rabbi Dayan Shmuel Hillman, a very prominent Lithuanian posek. As I say, he was for 20 years or more the head of the London Beth Din. More interesting was he had one sister. He had one sister, Sarah, who was married to Rabbi Isaac Yitzchak Halevi Herzog, who, as you know, in the 1930s was appointed to replace Rav Kook, who had died, as chief rabbi of Palestine, Eretz Israel. He was the first chief rabbi of the state of Israel until the late 50s, when he passed away and was replaced by another, because Herzog had been in Dublin. Herzog had been in Belfast and Dublin, and then he went to Eretz Israel, and he actually was replaced as chief rabbi by Rabbi Issa Unterman, who had previously been in Liverpool. So there was a strong British influence on the Israeli chief rabbinate in the early years, and Rav Kook also had been in England during the First World War. Of course, which means to say that he was a he was an uncle of President Chaim Herzog. He was a great uncle of the present head of the Jewish Agency, Isaac Bougie Herzog. I know Bougie fairly well. In the past, I've been involved in political issues with the government of Israel. He in the past was a minister. We've met on many occasions, and we've always ended up spending more time discussing the Hillman windows than we have discussing the matters on the agenda of the meeting. Sorry? Oh, okay. We'll get to that as well. And so here you can see Herzog Hillman. This was Rabbi Dr. Isaac Herzog, was then in Belfast, the only son of Rabbi Joel. His father, by the way, was also. He came from Lomja. He was originally the rabbi of Leeds. Afterwards, he was the rabbi of Paris. And he often came over to London for family occasions. A rabbinical marriage, the wedding of Diane Hillman's only daughter to Rabbi Herzog. That was as they say in our world, that was a good shidduch. In that, the Hillmans, the Herzogs, the Rabinowitz, these were good shidduchim they made. The story is that they all knew each other originally from Lithuania, and that they'd all agreed that if they were to come to Western Europe, because they didn't trust the English Jews, they would all marry their children with one another, which is basically what happened in that generation. We find a lot of the very prominent rabbis' families of that generation in the 20s, 30s, 40s, their children were all married with each other, and so and that was the case. This is the Hillman and the Herzog family. The boy in the white shirt in the middle is President Chaim Herzog, alav shalom. That was his nephew, and you have here basically the two Herzog brothers, and the three Hillmans. And the three Hillman, David Hillman had three sons. Chaim Herzog, Rabbi Herzog had two sons. And you see all five of them there. David Hillman at the back, Annie Hillman Rabinowitz, and Sarah Herzog. The only one missing is the chief rabbi himself. Just literally a few weeks ago, that's Annie Hillman, literally a few weeks ago, I got an email from someone in Modi'in in Israel who knows of my interest. He was working in the Rav Tzvi Yehuda Kook, the Rav Kook, archives in Israel, and he came up with the original copy of this wedding invitation of Annie Rabinowitz and David Hillman. Not only is the invitation interesting, but the invitee on the invitation is even more interesting. It was Rav Kook himself who was invited on this invitation. He had already gone back to Eretz Yisrael and he didn't come to the wedding. But he obviously knew them all from the time that he had been in London during the First World War. This lovely picture of his wedding. Those were the weddings of the day, and it was, in a sense, an ultra-Orthodox Haredi wedding. But if you could read this week's wedding and see the floral descriptions of the bride's attire and the bridesmaid's attire, it was quite something. I'm sure you've all seen pictures of weddings of that period, but this was the Hillman Rabinowitz wedding, and so on. Annie Hillman was the daughter of Rabbi Yaakov Rabinovitz, another significant Lithuanian rabbi, my great-grandfather. If the Hillmans came to Glasgow, he came at the end of the 19th century to be the rabbi of Edinburgh. He was in Edinburgh for 20 years, in the middle of the First World War. He came to London, where he was again for another 15 years, the rabbi of the Montague Road Beis HaMedrash in Dalston. He died on Christmas Day 1932 and is buried in the Edmonton Jewish Cemetery, which is one of the most interesting, if you think cemeteries are interesting, that is, I do. It is by far one of the most interesting cemeteries in London, has some very significant rabbinical figures there, and he is one who is buried there. And that was his father from Eastern Europe. Rabinowitz himself had children, so in other words, one of his daughters was the wife of Hillman, another son was Professor Louis Rabinowitz, who became chief rabbi of South Africa, and at the expense of being very egoistic, the person in the middle is my own grandfather, Rabbi David Newman, who married the oldest Rabinowitz daughter. This is a digression. I just want to say, what I'm very interested in is the impact of Lithuanian rabbis on Anglo Jewry of the 20th century. And although we always think of America and we think of Israel, there are a small number of very significant, very important Lithuanian rabbis who came through England in the 20th century, spent 20, 30 years here. Most of them retired to Israel before the establishment of the state, after the establishment of the state. And you see five very significant figures here. Rav Kook was here during World War I. Next to him is probably the person who left the biggest impact on Orthodox Jewry in England in the 20th century, Dayan Yechezkel Abramsky. In the middle is Rav Dessler, who replaced Rabinowitz in Dalston and then became the founder of the Gateshead Kollel. Next to him is Rav Elia Lapian, and next to him is Chief Rabbi Issa Yehuda Unterman. And you add to that the Hillmans and the Herzogs and the others. This was a very significant group of people who came through England at the time. They weren't really part of the formal establishment, so they've been written about a lot less, but in the Orthodox world, this is a very significant group of people. So we leave the family aside and we come to another very important man in the history of Isaac Wolfson. Isaac Wolfson, who of course became Sir Isaac Wolfson, one of the world's greatest Jewish philanthropists, grew up in the Gorbals in Glasgow, which is exactly where Rabbi Hillman and his children grew up in the early part of the century, and they knew each other as children. Maybe they played football on the streets together, I've got no idea. And you will find that a number of his windows are sponsored by Wolfson at a much later stage in his life, including the windows of the Chief Rabbinate in Jerusalem, and most significantly the collection we saw upstairs, because this synagogue, its rebuilding was funded by Wolfson and is sometimes jokingly known as Sir Isaac's. I have a great caricature on the wall of my office in Israel, which brings in my other love, and that is it shows a chazan. Maybe it's you, Stephen, but it was standing on the bimah, and there's a man down below with a tallis, and the chazan saying to him, I don't care if your name is Sir Isaac, I'm not making a mishaberach for the Spurs. And that was in the Jewish Chronicle about 40 years ago. You can see that the Wolfsons also dedicated some of their windows to the family. The majority of the pictures I'll show you are from St. John's Wood, but there are pictures from all around, including this shul, but that's where I've taken most pictures. So this is a collection of dedications he made for the Wolfson family in some of the Hagabai, Rav Shlomo Bar Shmuel, the Heichal Shlomo, the great synagogue of Jerusalem, is named after Isaac Wolfson's father, who is mentioned here as Hagabai Rav Shlomo ben Shmuel. I'm sorry, we missed one. These are his three sons, David Hillman's three sons, and let's move on to the windows themselves. There are a number of books which about synagogues. This is probably the most significant, Sharman Kaddish's book, Synagogues of Britain and Ireland. It's a hefty volume, an expensive volume. People who are interested in synagogue architecture, though, it's worth splashing out and getting this book. She has 2 pages about the Hillman windows. And I think, and she writes about who he was. There's another book which recently came out, we'll get to it. There are 2 books about synagogues of London. The Lost Synagogues of London by Peter Renton is a lovely book. I don't know how many of you know it, but when my father, Oliver Sholem, passed away in 2010, we were sitting Shiva in Yerushalayim in their flat, and on the coffee table was this book, and it became the focus of the conversation, I would say, for the whole of the week of the Shiva. Because people came and said, oh, I used to go to that shul, I know that shul, oh, here's my rabbi, here's my uncle, and so on. I don't know if any of you go on the walking tours with Rachel Kolsky, but she and I want to do a second edition of the Lost Synagogues of London because so many others have been closed down since that book was produced. There's another book that came out. It's more of a coffee table book. About 1.5 years ago, the 100 best stained glass sites in London, or is it in England? There are 4 Jewish sites there, and one of the 4 are the stained glass windows, the Hillman stained glass windows in St. John's Wood. Here's a location of the windows. So I don't know how many of you are sitting here and you see your synagogue mentioned in that list. St. John's Wood with 2 phases I'll talk about. The first phase was originally built for the original St. John's Wood Shul, which is in Abbey Road, which then became the New London Synagogue of Rabbi Professor Louis Jacobs. Not long before, but about the same time as the Jacobs affair, and these 2 things had nothing to do with each other, they were already building the new St. John's Wood Synagogue and had agreed to take the windows over. But those of you who know the present St. John's Wood Synagogue know it's a massive shul, and they needed additional windows, and so he had to make additional windows for St. John's Wood 25 years later, which are similar and different. I'll show you some pictures. You can make out which are the new and which are the old ones. Hampstead Garden suburb Norris Lee has, the shul here, Central Gate, Portland Street. Brondesbury and Hendon and Kenton were the windows all transferred from Cricklewood when it shut down. Is there any members of Kenton Synagogue here? Well, you have a really beautiful set because it's the only set which isn't at the side of the shul, but is at the front surrounding the ark. And when the sun shines in on those, it's really quite magnificent, I think. One of the most magnificent images there are. Marble Arch has in their lobby the windows transferred from Western, but they also have another set of Hillman windows inside the shul itself and some in the base of Medrash. Hampstead Denningtown Park Road has 2, amongst many, but very early windows of his. Woodside Park were the windows that used to be in New Cross. Boreham Wood were the ones transferred from Bayswater, with the exception of the one that is now in Ely Cathedral. Chelsea, I saw, has 3 windows. I found that out at a very late stage. And St. Albans has 2 windows. Actually, they're renovating the St. Albans Shul now, and I was driving very near there about 6 months ago, and I thought, well, I'll go and just knock on the door and see if someone's there. By chance, there was someone there, and I said, wow, these are really classic Hillman windows. He said, no, they're not, they're fake. He says, we're renovating the shul, and we wanted to put them in storage, and there are now companies that do copies of windows, and unless you're a real expert, you think they're the real thing. And they're in there while they're doing the renovation at the time. So that's the list of places that have, and you can see it's quite a significant long list of places. Outside of London, you have 2 or 3 in Leeds. Terenure in Dublin has some. The Rananim and the Bet Knesset HaNasi in Jerusalem and Ely Cathedral, but the vast majority, 90%, are all to be found in London. This is a dedication. You can go through the archives of the Jewish Chronicle, and you can, you look up the word David Hillman, stained glass windows, and you'll come up with all bits and pieces from over 50 years when windows were dedicated in one place or another. This is interesting. These are the 2 windows in the Bet Knesset HaNasi in Jerusalem are exactly the same as the 2 windows he did for the St. Albans Synagogue. It's the story of Ki Yikarei Kan Tzipor Baderech. We read in Deuteronomy and Dvarim that if you want to get the bird, you have to take it away from the eggs first. And this is the story of the Tzipor sort of flying away in that, and you probably can't see the text, but the text is the biblical text of that. This is the Renanim Synagogue in Jerusalem. Because they're not lit, the windows, the best time to see the windows lit is if the shul lights are on from outside in the street. That's the best way to see them lit up. And this is the Renanim Synagogue. I gave a talk about them last Chanukah inside the synagogue. We started by looking at them from the outside, and Buji Isaac Herzog actually came and gave the introduction to the talk. I wanted him, we tried to arrange this date, so as chairman of the Jewish Agency, he would be here, and he could open this talk. And of course, he was here just 2 weeks ago for the events of his father, but we just couldn't work it out. He was busy with other business, so we gave up on that one. As you see, St. Albans, very similar, 2 windows, the same story of the birds, Ki Yikarei. First of all, you send the children away before you take Shalach et ha'em ve'et habanim tikach lach. You send the mother bird away before you take the children. These are the 3 in Chelsea. Actually, I'm starting from the least known ones. The middle window is very interesting because it's unlike any other of his windows. I've not seen that style of window anywhere else. And if you look at the date, it's in the 50s, so it's not a very early window. I'm not quite sure how that one got in there. It's definitely a Hillman window. His name is there somewhere. But the 2 on the sides are typical of his other windows, and we'll come back to those. Terenure Dublin is a collection of his. You look at the bottom line, you can even see similar windows to the one we saw upstairs of the temple, of the sukkah, and of the laid table, which we saw. This is what you saw upstairs. Central Synagogue, St. Isaac's, sorry. Egerton Road, I forgot to mention Egerton Road, which is now Bobov Hasidim. A very early set of David Hillman windows. When Egerton Road shut down and the Bobov took over, which is good because I grew up in that area. I knew 3 big synagogues at the time. I knew Poets Road, Dalston, I knew Shackle Lane, I knew Egerton Road. Poets Road, where we lived, on top of the shul, on top of the shop, was knocked down and destroyed. There's a horrible block of flats there now. Shackle Lane became a mosque. And the only one that remained Jewish was Egerton Road because it's in the heart of the Hasidic area of Egerton Road. Bobov Hasidim took over. One of the 2 factions of Bobov in New York took it over. I'm not sure if it's the 45th Street or the 47th Street Bobov. They put it something like $1 million and put it into fantastic condition, although it's now more of a Bet Midrash than it is a synagogue. They took the furniture out and put in tables, but the rest they did up. And they weren't sure at the beginning what to do with the windows. In a Hasidic Bet Midrash, you don't have stained glass windows. But they were told very clearly that this is heritage. You can't touch any of these things. So if you go into the Bobov, Egerton Road synagogue today, has the Hillman windows, which I've explained to them. I've shown them how Jewish they are, so they have no problem. You still have the marble prayer for the royal family. And there's one big window at the entrance to the synagogue, which is not a Hillman window, done later. I don't know if it's in the 50s or the 60s. Yossi, do you know when it was done? The 60s, okay. This gentleman, who is a childhood friend of mine, his father was the lifelong secretary of the Egerton Road synagogue. And for that window, the Bobov had a problem, because it was done in honor of the State of Israel, and it had the semel, the image of the State of Israel in the middle. So for a long time, they simply covered it up from inside with a board. I went there about a year ago, and I found it was open. And I said to one of the Chassidim, I said, what's going on here? He told me, look carefully at the window. And I looked, and I'm not sure this was done with, as they say, all the right authorizations. There are 3 panels which have been changed. And no longer is it the semel of the State of Israel, but the rest of the window is a beautiful window, even though it's not a Hillman window. That's politics, okay. But it's a beautiful, they've done a great job of the Bet HaMidrash. It's been kept up, it's been renovated, it wasn't in great condition, and they have early Hillman windows there. This is the Hartog Gallery, members here of the Western Marble Arch. Well, you know that from the gallery upstairs, which is in a sense a mini museum in its own right. They were originally in the Western Synagogue. Bronsbury Park, as I said, they're the only ones that are lit up because they're not windows there. They're on the wall. They are not windows, they're on the wall, so they were lit up, and now actually they've been put in storage while Bronsbury is undergoing a renovation as well. Following the closure of Walm Lane, they're originally in Cricklewood. In February 2005, additional funds were raised in order to allow this beautiful series of windows to move to Bronsbury Park. These are the ones I was telling you about at Kenton. This is at the front, it surrounds the Aron Kodesh, so you're looking straight at them when you are in the prayer services in the Kenton Synagogue. Woodside Park came from New Cross. Woodside Park, very clever shul. Their furniture came from one shul in Sunderland. Their windows came from another shul in New Cross. But why not? I mean, otherwise these things get destroyed. So it's great to have these things move on to new synagogues, new shuls, particularly as most of the newer shuls we build tend to be much more mundane affairs than the old, beautiful cathedral-style synagogues they built 100 and 150 years ago, and which didn't have many more uses than being a synagogue. Today, the buildings are youth centers and social centers and community centers, and it's good to have some of them with nice windows. And the Bima and the Aron Kodesh is from the Beis HaMedrash in Sunderland, and the windows are from the New Cross Synagogue. As you can see, synagogue from the south, New Cross was southeast London. If any of you, by the way, have pictures of the inside of the South New Cross Synagogue, or Cricklewood, or Bayswater from before they were destroyed, I've been looking for pictures, I've been looking in the archives, and I haven't been able to find. If any of you grew up there, were married there, had their bar mitzvah there, and you have pictures, please let me know. Boreham Wood were all the other Bayswater windows, some of his earliest windows, probably another very magnificent set, but unfortunately they haven't been fitted in that well into Boreham Wood, and the bottom parts of the windows are covered by the wall, which is a great shame. You can't see his signature in the bottom rows there, but again, one of his classic sets, one of his earlier sets. St. John's Wood, as I say, have 120, upstairs, downstairs, and I'm told that some of them were actually completed in the 2 or 3 years after he died. His daughter-in-law, Louise Hillman, tells me that she helped complete some of the later windows, which is why they sometimes have different themes to his classic themes. You can see it's a massive shul with a massive lot of windows. St. John's Wood is a big shul, and it's too big for its present congregation. And they still get a lot of people, but you wouldn't know because it seats 1,400 people. So even if you have 300 people on a Shabbat, it still looks fairly empty. You notice it in the Kiddush if there are a lot of people or not. And there's a whole load of discussion. What do we do with this building in the future? And one of the big problems, considerations is You don't want to break up this set of windows. But once you downsize, you have a real problem with that. 3 windows to be found in St. John's Wood were a lot of them have very interesting hakdashot. They were paid for in honor of certain people. So where I sit in St. John's Wood is just in front of the 3 windows which were transferred from the old St. John's Wood and which in the mid-1950s were dedicated by the Maida Vale Zionist Society to Theodor Herzl, Chaim Weizmann, and Mordechai Eliash, who you may remember was the first Israeli ambassador to Britain after the establishment of the State of Israel. Again, we'll rush through some of this. This was the consecration of the windows in 54, consecration of some of the later windows in 80 in St. John's Wood as they were added at a later stage. And this is, of course, how United Synagogue ministers used to dress. Not anymore, they don't. But that was in 54. That was in 1980 at the consecration. There you can see Chief Rabbi Brody and Sir Isaac Wolfson. You can see Chief Rabbi Brody at the front of there. And they're the particular consecrations you see under the windows in memory of Chaim Weizmann, Herzl, and Mordechai Eliash. There's a little exhibition on the stairs in St. John's Wood showing a few of the windows, explaining some of the themes, and also showing how much or how little he got paid for these windows. If you look at the right side, received for 3 large, remember how large they were upstairs, received for 3 stained glass windows, all of them Yom Kippur windows for St. John's Wood Synagogue, 1952, the sum of £400 being made up as follows: 370 from Mr. S. Michaels and £30 from the United Synagogue. It hasn't changed. On behalf of Mr. Michaels. And I would say in 52, although £400 is worth a lot more than £400 today, I looked at the relative value of art at the time, and this was not the real value of an amazing, those 3 windows. And there's the receipt he wrote out for that. I just love this picture because of Jewish politics. In one of those books you saw, the Synagogues of London, they have on facing pages the New London and the St. John's Wood. It's the only place you will find the 2 shuls facing each other in harmony on the same page. So I just wanted to put that in. Actually, this Abbey Road, New London, for those of you who are members or go there, in a sense, is a much more beautiful shul than the new St. John's Wood. It's smaller and it's more beautiful. And for the 50 years since the windows moved, they've just had plain glass there. I understand they are now going to introduce some new stained glass windows there, but I can just try and imagine how beautiful the Hillman windows must have looked on a Kol Nidre night in the old Abbey Road, New London Synagogue, and that's another picture I'd like to get hold of somehow or other. That's what I told you about the coffee book of the 100 best stained glass sites. And they have 2 very detailed pictures about St. John's Wood and who he was. There's a booklet which was brought out by this synagogue, also which has the windows in, the splendours of the Central Synagogue. I'm not sure when that was brought out. 1990. Can you still get new copies of them?
Contact the administrator, Craig. He still has some. I think you get more.
Okay, right. But they have and actually, it's very hard. You have to be a professional photographer to take good photos. I've taken photos on my iPhone of all these, and I've got a collection. But you have to be a really good professional photographer with the right lighting equipment to know how to take. And the best set of photos are the photos in that book, in that collection of the Central Synagogue. Sorry?
With your permission, I'm not a professional photographer. I'd never taken a picture before. I went out, bought a very cheap one, hired a ladder, and I photographed one side in the morning when the sun was shining, the other side in the evening when the sun was shining on the other side, and that made the pictures in the book.
Oh, you did the picture? Okay, right. I'll give you my email afterwards. Okay. Again, because they're not lit, for instance, the St. John's Wood Synagogue it's surrounded by buildings, so even sometimes when the sun is out, it doesn't come through all the windows. That's also, as you saw upstairs, even the top windows, there was one along the edge there, which must have a building opposite or something, which was much darker than the other windows. Okay, in St. John's Wood, downstairs, you have 10 sets of 5. 5 sets of 5 on each side. Now, the middle 3 of every set were the original ones from Abbey Road. He was then asked to add 2 to every set. So the 2 outer ones were made 20, 25 years later. And I have taken 1 or 2 friends of mine along who understand art. I have to, as you realize, I'm no great maven of art. I understand the social context, the political context much better. But you can always see, first of all, they're much lighter. And they're slightly less complicated. That one of the art people who come in say, they're always very impressed by the window, but they always say that one of the problems with his windows is he puts too much into them. They're too complicated. There are too many images and too many words. And they're slightly less the case in the later ones, but nevertheless, this is classic. He has 10 sets of 5 like this downstairs. It's really 10 sets of 10 because there's a larger window with a small window at the top, and each set of 5 is round a theme. So this one is Rosh Hashanah. So all the 5 windows are about Rosh Hashanah. On the whole, when he did the 2 new ones, they were mirror images. In this case, they're not totally mirror images. You do have 2 people with their heads covered by a talit, but in one they're blowing a shofar, and in one he's just praying. But I think if you were to go there, you would make that out very clearly. Again, you can see Sukkot. So the 2 outer ones are mirror images of each other, which were done 25 or so, 20 to 25 years later. Again, the Sukkah in the middle is the one we saw upstairs in the windows. These are pictures I took here quite recently, because they're the only ones I know that have curved tops. But they tend to be of the same theme. So if you do a close-up, you see, I think that's one we even looked at when we were upstairs. That's the Hanukkah window we looked at. The one with the 10 Commandments or Shana Rabbah. They're exactly the same ones that I showed you upstairs. I'm just going to flick through these without speaking about them until I come to some themes. 1, because they're too many, and 2, because I think they're self-explanatory. Classic Rosh Hashanah with the sheep. Yom Kippur, open the gates. Shalosh Regalim, this is obviously Shavuot because it has the Megillah of Ruth, which we read on Shavuot. David Hillman, 5718. So that's quite an early window. Pesach, tell the story to your sons. And there you have a Haggadah with Manishtana, the text of Manishtana written in it. And remember, these are just small parts of a single window, the bits I've blown up here. Sukkot, the one we've seen on a number of occasions already. Hoshana Rabbah, this is from upstairs. Shaking the lulav, and so on. Shavuot again. Chanukah, this is his classic Chanukah one. You'll see in 5 or 6 different shuls. Purim, he has some great Purim windows, not just the one in Ely Cathedral. Rosh Chodesh. Shabbat. Vayechulu hashamayim va'aretz mikol tzva'im is written there somewhere. This is his Messianic era ones on the far left of St. John's Wood. I'm not so keen on the Messianic ones, but here you have ve'egel ukfil mri yachdav, that the lamb and the wolf are living together in harmony, until he has the picture of the lion and the sheep all in total harmony. I think these must be these look like the Terenure, the Dublin ones, which are done in slightly different colours, slightly different style, but they're definitely his windows at the bottom centre. And then we come to one of the things that interests me most, the faces. He has quite a number of windows with partial hidden faces. It is not accepted, at least not in Orthodox synagogues, to have the image of a person on the window or any other decoration, because this is considered transgression, that you shall not have any other graven images except for me from the 10 Commandments. He has a number of windows where the faces, you have the back of a person lighting a Chanukiah. You sometimes have partial faces with the head covered by a talit. And right next to where I daven in St. John's Wood, you have this window. It's the Purim window, virtually the latest date I can find on any window, and I'm not sure whether he did it himself, it was done after he passed away, but no one clearly raised any objection. And these are two full frontal faces. I've often asked my good friend, who I see most days in St. John's Wood, Diane Binstock, who's also very interested in these about this, and he says he doesn't know, he's also looked into the history, and he doesn't know how at the time they allowed the full frontal face to be there, but I'm glad to say it's okay. No one touches it, no one has suggested in any way whatsoever they be removed, but this is exceptional in all of his windows. You won't find that in any of the other shuls, in any of the other windows. Again, covered faces blowing the shofar. He also has, these are the ones I took upstairs when I found eventually there were some with an Israeli flag along the side. And if you go really into them, I mean, this is a small section of a large window, you suddenly see that tzitzit on one of the people has tchelet, the blue. His brother-in-law, Chief Rabbi Herzog, wrote his doctoral thesis in 1920 at the University of London on the issue of tchelet. What is tchelet? What is the color blue that they used to have on the ritual fringes in the temple? And some people in Israel, by the way, have reintroduced this today and go around with tzitzit with a tchelet on. But suddenly, a few weeks ago, someone came up to me in the middle of shul and said, "Have you seen this?" And so I came back the following morning to take a picture, and there's a person with a tchelet on his... and even though when you blow up a regular window of his, look at the amazing detail of the tzitzit, the different chords, the knots. I mean, the detail is quite amazing on some of these. He has a lot with flowers, particularly in the top level of St. John's Wood. I don't think there's any particular biblical significance to the style of flowers he has. Maybe they just had to complete so many, they had to put something in. I don't know the answer to that one. Birds and animals, he has a few musical instruments, but they're mostly musical instruments which are mentioned as being musical instruments that were used in the temple for the holy worship of the Levites and so on. And it was Louise who said to me, "Have you seen the Jerusalem windows?" I said, "No." She said, "Some of the windows that I helped do after he passed away," she said, "I wanted to put in different themes, so I put in some Jerusalem windows." And I walked upstairs to St. John's Wood and I found these two windows, which I think really are lovely windows. Whether the actual original design can be attributed to him or not, I'm not sure. But they're pictures of the Jerusalem. There are three of these. They're these two. They're these two. Again, someone came up to me, and someone who actually, one of the two people who gives me a ride every morning, came up to me once in the middle of the show and said, "Come and have a look at this window." Says, "Look through the window." And there's a house from Hendon in northwest London. What it's doing there, we haven't worked out. But if you look through the window, this is it's the only window where it appears, you see this house there. And this one here, which looks more like, I don't know, it looks more like Christmas. I heard you say it, yeah. I'm not sure what those two houses in the windows are doing, but the idea that you look through the window and see what's on the outside, maybe when you're bored with the rabbi's sermon and your gaze is somewhere else, I mean, that's also quite something. And again, the detail, you can see the Shabbos table, outside the window is a house covered in snow, looking out.
Are they Hillman windows?
Yes, so definitely. The rest of the window, I mean, it's just such a small section within what is clearly a Hillman window, that there's no question. This I found at your father's house. Mickey Hillman, the one surviving son, David Hillman, who lives today in Hampstead, has some of his original papers, and you can see this is how he designed them, so simply. I don't know if you'd get away with it in art school today, but he used to have scraps of paper and say, "Look, this is Hanukkah, and in the middle I'm going to put Neirot, candles, and at the side I'm going to put this text and that," and that's what he worked with. That's how he worked, that's what the text he worked with. Very simple, I'm not sure if he sort of did the things according to the rules. Would you call him a pre-modern, postmodernist? I don't know. But that's the sort of material he worked with. And then the texts. I chose some windows with very full text. Here you have Rosh Hashanah with some really full text. And so on. Long sections of the Musaf and the Shacharit prayer from Rosh Hashanah. Are they painted? They're done however you do. This shows my ignorance of how you do stained glass windows. They are done how you do stained glass windows. I mean, I don't think they're painted as such. Anyone can tell me about that? Not to the best of...
They're painted with a mixture, a powder that's a mixture of ground glass and pigment, and it's worked to a paste with water, and then painted on with a
Okay.
brush.
And actually, your father, this is Mickey Hillman's son, told me once that when he was a teenager, young man, he actually earned extra pocket money by doing some of the lettering on the windows. And he himself is an architect by profession, so he probably also had the artistic skill.
I forgot to mention that it's fired in a kiln, so that it becomes integral.
Oh, so even the text is fired in the kiln. Yeah, okay. That would make sense, sure. So again, the text on the sending of the bird away. And these are taken from the Borum wood, Bayswater windows. Again, the text is at the bottom of the windows, Midata, and so on. This is one I found in his house, an unfinished work, which he never got round to finishing, the only unfinished piece of work I've ever found. And as I said, he had very few to Israel of the Holocaust. On the far left of the St. John's Wood, he has one set of 3 windows which is dedicated to the Holocaust. These are from 3 windows. El Malei Rachamim, prayer, Chamot HaMetzik Baratzot, Germania, Anabal HaRachamim Hastirem Beseder. This is the memorial prayer to those who have died in the Holocaust. But it's the only case, although most or many of his windows were done in the 50s, it's the only one I've found which is dedicated in that way. There are 2 windows at the top in St. John's Wood. One is dedicated to his father, Lezecha Avi Rabbi Mori HaGaon Shmuel Yitzchak Hillman, Rosh Beit Din of London, the head of the London Beit Din, Mechaber. He wrote the following books. He was a great Talmid Chacham on the Bavli Yerushalmi, Mechilta, Sifra, and Rambam. And so that's one window dedicated to his father. And next to it is a window dedicated to his wife, Dr. Annie Hillman, but when she passed away a few years before him, by her husband, dedicated by him and his family. Ellis, Harold, Mayer are his 3 sons. Louise and Heidi are 2 of his daughters. I assume that Harold was not yet married at the time. I don't know, so that was dedicated. But they're the only ones dedicated to his own family. At one point, he was elected a member of the British Society of Master Glass Painters, which I think, given his life's work, was nothing less than should have happened. And these are the memorials to him in Bushy Cemetery next to each other, in fond memory of Dr. Annie Hillman and in fond memory of David Hillman. And with there, I'll put an end to it and invite your comments and questions. I have no idea. All I can tell you is that the gentleman in the United Synagogue who is in charge of all the archives and knows, and the best secrets aren't in the archives but the ones in his head, the only comment he made to me is a comment I made here. He says the one window went for a walk. And he says there may be some other shuls which someone who knows what the original collection were and what the new collection were, there may be some others that went for a walk or in someone's private collection today, but they didn't keep a good record of them at the time. If I could get a heritage sort of grant, I would want someone to do a total inventory of everything there is and at least some good photography of everything there is. But even that costs, and this, as I say, this is my love research, my hobby research. It's not something I do as a profession.
Can you repeat questions?
I'm happy. I mean, you'll decide when to finish. You're the boss here, so you'll decide. Yes, please.
It's interesting that there's none of his windows in any of the Glasgow synagogues.
Not to the best of my knowledge, there are none in Glasgow. To the best of my knowledge, no.
There's a big Jewish population in Glasgow.
There was a very large Jewish population. I think at one time it was the third largest outside London, Manchester, maybe Leeds and Glasgow. Yeah, but no, to the best of my knowledge, there are no Hillman windows in Glasgow. Yes, please.
You said it in your opening page that he studied at the Glasgow School, art school, or academy, or something like that. Did he ever go into fine art? Do you know how he got into?
Well, how he got into it, I don't know. I know that he also studied in the Royal School in London, and I think in his earlier days he painted portraits. I think he came into window because I think his earliest windows are the late 20s. So there was a whole period before. I think it was more into portraits. And again, in Mickey Hillman's house, he has an original portrait of his brother-in-law, Rav Herzog, who was then in his 30s, on the wall of the house. I think he was into portraits. Maybe it was part of this sort of tension going on between him and his father, so he went into Jewish topics. I don't know how and why, but he clearly had a period before he did the windows that he was painting something else. Yes, please.
I think perhaps there are some non-Jewish people here, and I wondered if anybody who might be not Jewish and is interested in stained glass windows in churches, in cathedrals, what impact did these windows have on them, if there is anybody who would like to say anything?
Well, while people are thinking, I want to say something very strange about his windows. His windows are very Jewish windows. Now, there were many stained glass windows in synagogues before then, with Jewish themes, but they were very similar, in my non-professional perspective, to church stained glass windows, the style. He was very Jewish in the way he did them. He departed. I mean, his windows are nothing like the ones you will find in the cathedral synagogues of the end of the 19th, early 20th century. And I think they're very different to the more modern generation of windows which came after him. So I think they're very distinct, unless someone can tell me otherwise. Yes, I'm allowed to say you're David Hillman's grandson. Yeah.
Just on that point about how he got into it, we've actually got a painting that he did in his early years of a woman smoking a cigarette. She's dressed very, very informally, so I'm sure his father would have disapproved of this picture. So I think he definitely came into it from fine arts before stained glass. I had a question actually, which maybe Ruth over there might be able to answer. I need to try to get a sense of how long it would have taken him, not just to design, but to create a single window, because it looks to be the most extraordinary amount of work.
And 250 of them.
250 of them. So, even just ballpark figure, how many hours would that be?
Well, I'm quite a slow worker, but I've never made anything on the scale of those windows, and they are very, very intricate and very carefully painted, but very lot of detail.
Do you both design and make?
Yes.
You do both, okay,
Yes. And there's a very strong craft element. I myself do everything in the process except the leading up. And I don't know how long it would take me to make one of those. I suppose about a year. But if he's got 200 windows to make...
Amazing, yeah. Your father says that all they remember of him as a kid is that early in the morning, he came back from shul, went up to his studio, came down for a bit of lunch and for supper in the evening, and he just spent his whole life up in the studio. So he obviously invested a lot of time in it. Yes, at the back there, please.
One of the fascinating things about the window, which I find fascinating, is that they're not just a painting. You did a comparison to one of the cathedrals where you see stained glass, which is merely a painting. These are a story within a story. And if you look at any one of those 26 that we have here, the center panel is a story like The Lion and the Lamb. And when you look at the borders, each panel in the borders is an extension of that story, and you can virtually read the whole story and the theme of it and combine it with the center panel. That's, I think,
And you see that in those rough, rough drawings he had, yeah.
brilliant. It's not merely doing the same artwork, it's the story itself that is incorporated.
That's rabbinical, actually. That's lack of taste.
I honestly believe that these windows need to be covered once, not just as a Jewish art treasure, which it is, but I think they need to be covered by, some national art reporter, because I think these really are a national art treasure. They're unique, they're different. Some people will like the style, some people won't like the style, but they're really a unique thing, and they exist really only here in London.
It might be something that Alan Yent or someone like that should do a programme on it, because I'm actually not Jewish, and I've really enjoyed your presentation tonight. But it might be that, the David OBE stained glass windows could be treated in a similar way. He did a programme recently with David Hockney on the new stained glass window that's been that's now in Westminster Abbey. So, to me, it would sound like a lovely programme, which would be of interest wider than the Jewish community. Yeah. And a good way to help people understand that, there's so much in common.
And this is the last question from an artist himself.
Just something that came up. Stained glass was taught in all British art colleges. I'm an ex-art student myself, and we had stained glass department 6 taught at the Royal College of Art, it was taught at Liverpool College of Art where I was, and other major art schools.
Right, there is a refreshment here, so please don't go. Stay and share your ideas and impressions. Before we thank David for his marvelous presentation, goes up and down, I just want, you have got all the brochures of what we do. But one thing, we have heard Anglo jewelry, we had Lithuanian jewelry here, but we didn't have Eastern European, Ukrainian representation. So we have got tickets which we can hold only until Tuesday, and this is a one-man show about Shalom Aleichem. For anybody who doesn't know, Shalom Aleichem was the writer of the shtetl, of the life of Jews in Eastern Europe, and you know about him from Fiddler on the Roof, because his book has been turned into a film. The tickets with us are only £14, but we have to get rid of whatever is left with us by Wednesday morning. So if anybody would like to come to it, you can give me the 14 or 15 pounds because I don't have change at the moment, and your name will be there as it was here. And it really is something, because I think that Fiddler on the Roof is a bit schmaltzy, a bit kind of making it for the world at large. But Shalom Aleichem wrote it for his Jewish people. It has criticism in it. It has sarcasm, but it has a lot of love to his brethren in their situation there. So I think you will not forgive yourself for not coming to it, but if you can come, please buy your tickets either online or from me now, and we would love to see you. But this is just by and by. We had a marvelous presentation from David, as David always does, and you could feel the family passion and the family love from David to his ancestors and to the pride that he has that his great, what do you call it, great uncle, call it that, what he has inspired people while they come to the synagogues. And maybe when we all come to the synagogues next time, we will also focus our gaze on the stained glass window around us. So thank you very much for being here.
I can't recall ever going to a Spiro Arc presentation before. I may very well have done, but I happen to be very interested in the stained glass windows. I spend my time in St. John's Wood Synagogue. Every now and again I'm looking at the pictures, looking at the windows. I walk up and down, staring at them, trying to decipher what everything's about, trying to understand it. And this put everything into perspective for me. It didn't solve all the mysteries, but it's just great. I think that it would be marvelous if there'd be a coffee table presentation volume of some sort. That would be very good, and I would be a buyer.
I was invited to this evening's event. My wife is a stained glass artist. I'm an artist myself, and went through the British Art School system when stained glass was a part of the curriculum, and I thought that the talk this evening was most illuminating, and it was a very, very beautiful presentation. And I'm very pleased to have been asked to be here. Thank you very much. Is that all right?
I was happy to learn about my great-grandfather because I hadn't known about him and his stained glass windows, and the lecture was really interesting. And I also found out how different people were related in my family and what they did. And I also enjoyed seeing some of them and seeing the patterns. And earlier on we got to see the stained glass windows in the actual synagogue, and he talked about them, which was really good.
Who are you? How are you related?
He was my great-grandfather.
What do you think of Spiro Art events?
Wait, what? Oh, the different...
Spiro Art events, Nitz's events. What do you think of their events?
I thought that was really interesting as well, and I also liked how he did a stained glass window for each of the different celebrations. So he had themes, and the way I also enjoyed the details he did, like the windows with the houses.
Hi, well, I enjoyed it very much because I have two connections to this. My cousin is a cousin of David Newman, and I enjoyed it very much. I didn't know he had such pictures all over the world. And many years ago, I had a date with Ellis Hillman. That's David Hillman's son. So, and do you want to speak as well?
Oh, thank you very much.
I'm going to let Rose speak. She's famous.
What do you want me to say?
Just
Tell us what you
speak.
thought. Just face me and the microphone here. Forget about the microphone.
Yes.
And just, what do you think of the event?
Well, very beautiful. It was nice to be able to see the windows in the flesh, though pity the light was fading. But quite amazing the amount of windows he did, and also how intricate and detailed they are.
What do you think of the Spiro Arc events?
Well, I've been a fan of the Spiro Art for many, many years, and I've enjoyed their lectures. And now I don't go out so much at night, so I haven't been to recent events, but they're wonderful.
And tell us about your works in connection with this. Were they inspired or not?
Well, they had a beautiful centre in Kidderpore Avenue many years ago, and I went to lectures about Jewish history, and they inspired two panels which I made, and they were on display there for many years. One was called Kiddush Hashem, which was about memory of the medieval times, the martyrs who had suffered during that era. And the other is called Sepharad, and it's about the Jews of Spain, well, before they were expelled.
Well, I found it absolutely fascinating on a whole number of levels. On a personal level, because David Hillman was my grandfather, and I knew him in my first few years of life, so it was great to find out so much about his life and his work. But I learned an enormous amount as well about stained glass and about his artistic work, and a whole range of other things. I thought it was a wonderful lecture, and I think David did us proud. This is the first one I've been to, so I will sign myself up for the mailing list.